everybody, my name is Deja and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm giving y'all some winter book recommendations. I really want to do book recommendations for every single season this year because I feel like I've always been a seasonal reader, but in 2024 that was the first year that I made like seasonal TBRs and actually like really stuck to them. Obviously I would make them like 50 books long, so I didn't read all 50 books, but I did read like quite a few off each TBR, and I feel like I have a lot more seasonal recommendations underneath my belt since doing that. So I really wanted to start giving y'all some seasonal recommendations because I love reading seasonally personally. Like, I think it's the best way. Obviously there are some books that have like no season to them, but there are some books that I feel like if you don't read them in the season that they're allotted for, they're just like not as good. They're not gonna hit the same. And I feel like for a lot of these books that's the case. They're still all amazing books, but I feel like they hit the best during winter. I have 15 books, which includes mostly thriller, horror, and fantasy, with like 2 other random genre books thrown in at the end. Most of the recommendations I do will probably have thriller and horror in it, but fantasy I feel like is a genre that I only really read in the fall and winter. I feel like romance is something I read more in the spring and summer, so those genres may be more specific to the season. I feel like there are thriller and horrors that are good for every single season, so those will definitely be popping up for every single season, but the other genres may vary a little bit depending on the season. I'm going to start with thrillers first, and I have to mention the classic No Exit. This is one of the first thriller books that I ever read because it was just so hyped on BookTube and is still so hyped on BookTube. If you haven't read this book, I would be shocked, and if you haven't heard of it, I'd be even more shocked. This one truly does live up to the hype, and it is one of the best thrillers I've ever read to this day, and it is the perfect read for winter, so I just wanted to recommend it in case you haven't read this book or haven't heard of it. Now's the time to do it. It is amazing, and it's also really good for beginners. As I said, it was one of the first thrillers that I ever read, so if you are new and you don't really read thrillers that often, I don't think this one is too like graphic or dark, but it still has very thrilling elements in it and is super fast paced and quick to get through. This one follows Darby, who is a college student and is actually on the way home to see her sick mother, and so she's driving. It's super snowy and it starts to blizzard, so she pulls off to a rest stop and has to wait out the storm, which is basically the whole night. So she has to spend the night with 4 other strangers that have also done the same thing, where they pulled off because obviously you can't really drive through a blizzard. You can't see, your tires don't really go through the snow that well, you just fighting. So they all have pulled off and are staying at this rest stop. Darby wants to call her mother, so she tries to call her, has no reception, so she decides to go outside. I don't know what that was, but that really scared me. I don't know if y'all heard that, but that was terrifying. I'm glad I can see my whole apartment from this one angle because I like know nothing's going on, but that was terrifying. So Darby goes outside to try and get better cell reception, still has no luck, and when she's like walking back into the rest stop, she's passing the cars and looks into the back of them and sees that in one of the cars there is a little girl locked in a cage in the back of this person's vehicle. She doesn't really know like which stranger owns which car, so now she knows that there's a little girl kidnapped and she has to go back inside. She has no way to escape, no way to get this girl out, no cell reception, no anything. So she's trying to figure out, first of all, who kidnapped this girl, why did they kidnap this girl, and how she's gonna get her and this little girl out of this situation. It is so amazing. It is so fast paced and so thrilling. Like, I really think that this thriller is perfect for anybody, whether you're new to thrillers, whether you're a seasoned thriller reader. I'd be surprised though if you haven't read this one. It's such a well plotted thriller, and it is truly like the epitome of the thriller genre in my opinion. Next up I have Rock Paper Scissors by Alice Feeney. Again, this is an amazing one, and I love Alice Feeney's writing. This one follows Adam and Amelia, and their marriage is basically on the rocks. Their anniversary is upcoming, and they end up winning this trip to snowy Scotland to spend their anniversary weekend away. They're thinking maybe this is just what their marriage needs, but they know that this trip is going to make or break their relationship. A big part of the story is that Adam, the husband, actually has lived with face blindness his whole life, and he cannot recognize any of his friends or family, including his wife, based off their face. He can only do it based off their voice and things like that, but never off their face, and that is such a huge part of this story, and it is such an interesting part as well. Turns out that they did not actually randomly win this trip, and someone is plotting against them, and also one of them is lying. They've been married for 10 years, they have 10 years of secrets, and their relationship is on the rocks. This one is a little bit more of a domestic thriller, which is not my favorite, but I feel like Alice Feeney does things that I don't traditionally like so well, and she has such amazing twists. I know some of them are not always for everybody, but I love the twists, and this one is no different. I think it's so well plotted, and the twist really had me jaw dropped, so I would highly recommend this one. It's super snowy, super atmospheric. The snow and the weather definitely play a part in the story, so I feel like this one is perfect to read in the winter. Next up I have The Writing Retreat by Julia Bartz. This one is another one that takes place in a snowy location. We follow Alex, and she is a young writer that is basically given up on her dreams of becoming a writer, but she actually is offered a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity opportunity to go to a writing retreat at the estate of a very famous feminist horror writer. She finds out that Ren, her former best friend and her current rival, is actually going as well, but she does not let that dampen her excitement. She's still really excited to go and meet this super famous author and have this writing retreat where she can really hone her craft. But when she gets there, the famous author drops this bomb that basically every single one of the people who was invited to this writing retreat needs to write a full entire novel within the month that they are going to be there, and whoever writes the best novel is going to be offered a 7-figure publishing deal. So Alex decides, like, she's like, no, I gotta lock in for real. And so she is trying to lock in, but then some weird things are going on. The famous author is acting erratic, her former best friend and her are definitely having some tensions, and then one of the writers actually ends up disappearing. This book definitely is a bit unhinged. It goes into a completely different direction than you would anticipate. The other two thrillers I mentioned are a little bit more straightforward, and even though they do have shocking twists, you're like, oh, okay, like that makes sense. This one, the twists kind of were a little bit unhinged, and you're just like, what? If you like the unhingedness of The House Across the Lake by Riley Sager, I feel like you would like this one. They do go in completely different directions, but I feel like if you like the kind of out-of-pocket nature of those twists, you would like the out-of-pocket nature of these twists as well. And this one was so fun. I love seeing all these writers in this isolated setting, and I just thought it was so interesting and fun to read. I have another Taylor Adams book on this list, and that is The Last Word. This one is more like rainy than it is snowy, but it has an isolated setting as well. And really, this one you could read any time of year, but I just think, again, it would hit the best in winter. This follows Emma, and she lives in isolation with her dog because she's actually house sitting at an old beachfront house in rainy Washington, and she's like along the coast. So that's why I feel like it's also wintry, because it's giving like rainy, cold coast vibes. And our main character really does not have, and Emma really does not have any human interaction at all, except she does have a neighbor that she communicates with, like they are in that Taylor Swift music video for You Belong With Me, where they write on the pieces of paper, and that's how like they communicate. Emma loves to read, and one day she picks up this horror book that is super poorly written, and she just like reads it on Amazon or something like that, and she ends up writing a scathing review, tearing the book to shreds, honestly, but not anything more than like I would do. She was just being honest about the book. She wasn't like attacking the author or anything like that. She was just writing an honest review of a really bad book. She then gets into an argument back and forth with the author of that book, and weird things begin to happen at night, and she thinks maybe this author is after her. Again, this one is so fun, so fast paced. If you liked No Exit, I would recommend this one next. This one is really campy though. Like, there is a katana used as a weapon in this book. A katana. You're just like, what? So this one is definitely more fun and campy, but it still has like that isolated setting, and I just love the setup of a woman writing a scathing review and then the author basically coming after her. Like, that is so interesting, and as readers, this is potentially something that could happen to us. It was just really fun and enjoyable read. The last thriller I have on this list is The Overnight Guest by Heather Gudenkaw. This one follows Wiley, who is a true crime writer, and she has decided to retreat to this isolated farmhouse out in the middle of nowhere, and it is snowing bad. So she's just like, you know what, this is cozy, it's snowing, I have a fireplace, I'm gonna lock in and I'm gonna write this book. But turns out in this house a couple decades earlier, 2 people were murdered and a little girl disappeared. But as the storm worsens, Wiley finds herself trapped inside this farmhouse and also finds a little child outside in the snow, and she brings them in, obviously, because she's like, someone abandoned this child in the snow and it's freezing outside, literally. But turns out that this farmhouse is not as isolated as Wiley thought, and someone is coming after them. This one does have dual perspective, where the other perspective takes place in the summer, so I feel like this one could be read in the summer as well. But most of it does take place during the wintry snowstorm atmosphere. Some of the twists in here really did shock me. It's not my favorite thriller of all time, but if you're looking for something that's atmospheric and is going to get you into the season, this is a great one. Moving on to horror, I have another booktube staple, and that is I'm Thinking of Ending Things by Ian Reid. In this one, we follow a couple who is driving, and I believe the snowstorm starts right as they get to their destination, but on their way back, they're definitely driving through the snow. This couple is talking in the car as they're road tripping to see the boyfriend's parents, and we follow the perspective of the girlfriend, actually, and we're in her head as she is thinking about ending things with Jake, and that it's just time to move on. This book, I really cannot say any more about it. It goes in a completely different direction than you would anticipate at all. Like, this book is one of the ones that truly shocked me, because the way that this went is just not anything that I ever had seen before this book, and I really haven't seen much like it since. It truly is like a fever dream of a story, slowly like descend into that. So it feels super realistic as you start, and then it slowly just like gets more and more confusing, but in the best way possible. And it's also not too long. So if you're looking for something to just binge in one night by by the fireplace, I feel like this is really where it's at, because you are gonna just start the story and then slowly get more and more confused but also gagged as you're going on. Next up, I have Near the Bone by Christina Henry. This book perfectly balances realistic horror with creature feature horror. This one follows Maddie, and her husband live on this very isolated part of a mountain. She doesn't have any communication with the outside world really at all because of her husband. He is very, very abusive, and that is the more realistic horror of the story, is this horrible man that abuses his wife. One day, Maddie is out and about on the mountain and finds a mutilated fox body and realizes that they are not alone on this mountain, and believes that there is a creature doing this. And then 3 people come to the mountain and try to basically find this creature, and Maddie knows that these people getting so close to them is going to really anger her husband, and bad things happen when he is angry. So it balances having like this creature element, and we do follow the perspectives of the other 3 people and kind of like them trying to find this creature, but also Maddie dealing with the creature, but then also her abusive husband. This one is definitely hard to read at times and not something that's going to be super fun or joyful, but it is snowy, it's set on a mountain, and I don't even really like creature feature books that much because I like the more realistic horror, but I feel like this perfectly balanced that. Next up, I have one of my favorite books, if not my favorite horror book of all time, and that is Into the Drowning Deep by Myra Grant. This one is not snowy, but it takes place on a boat over the ocean. It's kind of more like cold ocean vibes. Like, I'm thinking about like pirates on a ship and like the water splashing over and like getting them all cold and wet. Like, it kind of gives those vibes. So 7 years prior to this book, there was a crew of people that set out on the ocean to go above the Mariana Trench to film a mockumentary about basically mermaids slash sirens, and everybody who was on deck mysteriously disappears, and there is some footage that is recovered from this mockumentary that kind of hints at potentially these creatures actually being real. A lot of people think that it's a hoax, but a lot of people also think that it's real. So now current day, there is a new ship of people going out to try and uncover what happened to the first ship and see if mermaids slash sirens are actually real or not. And a lot of people on the second ship are actually related to the first ship. This one truly is one of my favorite horror books of all time, and I love how sciencey it is. If you don't really like science in your books, you probably won't like this one. I don't really read sci-fi or anything like that, but I love like biology and science. I feel like this approached mermaids from a very scientific point of view because we have actual scientists going on the ship, and so we are learning about their work and their research, and I loved that so much. We also have a lot of other people on the ship, like people who specialize in linguistics and even deaf individuals, because they think that the mermaids potentially communicate through sign language. And I took sign language in high school, so I loved seeing sign language in this story. And there's a lot of queer characters. The cast is pretty large, but I feel like you really begin to connect to these characters. If you're interested at all, please give it a try, because I think that this one is a bit underrated. It does have a decent amount of readers, but not as much now because this book did come out like 7 years ago. Please like give it a chance. I think it's so good. It is such a well done horror book. And again, I feel like this is one you could read any time of year, but it kind of gives like cold ocean vibes, so I feel like it's just best in the winter. And the last horror book that I have is more of like a literary horror, and that is Moon of the Crusted Snow. This follows an indigenous community right as winter is about to begin, and they go completely dark. So they do have like power and resources and stuff like that, but everything goes dark completely because the apocalypse has actually begun. So they are rationing and limiting resources, and they are trying to stick to themselves as much as possible, but an outsider shows up and kind of disturbs things in the community, and then more people begin to show up and trying to exploit this community. We're truly just exploring this community as they are dealing with the apocalypse and winter, because in winter there's not as much food, there's a lot of death and sickness, and that is definitely explored through this one. But also we have a lot about indigenous culture. I don't want to mispronounce the community. It is a specific indigenous community, but I don't want to mispronounce it, so I'm just going to say indigenous, but it does explore their culture, and I love seeing that in this story so much. And it is super wintry. It definitely explores winter and what it would be like if we don't have resources, which is very horrifying and scary, because winter is scary. Like, so many people died in the winter when we didn't have resources, and that's what happens in this story. Next, we're gonna move on to fantasy, and it's very much like a winter genre for me personally. So I have like 2 more traditional fantasies and then 2 cozy fantasies, and these are just ones that I really love. First up is An Ember in the Ashes, and we follow an empire that is based based off Rome. In this empire, defiance is met with death. It is a very, very harsh empire, but we specifically follow our main character, Laia. She lives with her grandparents and her brother, and they just kind of live in the impoverished back streets of the kingdom. Laia's brother is actually arrested for treason, so Laia obviously wants to help her brother and knows how harsh the empire can be. So she decides to work with some rebels that agree to rescue her brother if she will go into the empire's military academy to spy for them. So she becomes a spy who's in this military academy, and we also follow a soldier named Elias who is being trained at this military academy. Elias, even though he was trained his entire life to basically enforce all of the harshness of the empire, he doesn't really like it at all. And they soon realize that their fates are actually intertwined. This is honestly like probably my favorite fantasy series I've ever read. I absolutely love and adore it. It is amazing. I love the characters. I love the plot. But the first book really stands out. Like, it really does that fantasy thing where the scope of the first book is so small and then it just continues to grow and grow and grow with each book. But the first book, something about that smaller scope is just so amazing. I feel like the harshness of the empire and the military academy definitely kind of reflects the harshness of winter, which is why I wanted to put it on this list. Next up, I have a middle grade, and that is Amari and the Night Brothers. We follow our main character, Amari, and her brother recently disappeared. He lives in the projects. He's actually gotten full ride scholarships to Ivy Leagues and something like that. So Amari knows something is wrong and that he would never just like run away and leave, but nobody's been looking into his disappearance. It hasn't been on the news at all, and the police just kind of think like, oh, he's another impoverished black kid. He was probably just like involved in drugs or something else illegal. And then one day she finds a ticking briefcase in her brother's stuff, and she begins to go through it and finds out that he left her a nomination to try out for the secretive Bureau of Supernatural Affairs. So Amari ends up going to the tryouts to try and figure out what happened to her brother, and so she is trying out against some of the people who have always known about this world, and they're super wealthy and rich, and she doesn't have as much resources or knowledge or time in this world. And each student also has a talent that is enhanced to supernatural ability, but Amari's is literally illegal. So she's just standing out. Everybody thinks that she's the enemy, but she's just trying her best to make it through the 3 tryouts to try and figure out what happened to her brother. It kind of does give like Harry Potter vibes. Like, if you're looking for something similar to the vibe that you get from that series, then I would really, really recommend this one. And I feel like it's just like so cozy to read for this time of year, and it has amazing commentary, which I really loved as well. Next up, I have a recent booktube fave, and that is Legends and Lattes. This is a cozy fantasy where we follow Viv, a battle-stricken orc who is tired of being in battle, so she decides she's going to retire and open up a coffee shop, which she has discovered coffee amongst her travels. She goes to the small town to open up this coffee shop and realizes that they have no idea what coffee is. So she's trying to open up this coffee shop, but is really struggling because they don't know what coffee is, and she's trying to like introduce them to coffee and this idea of coffee. So we see her starting her coffee shop from her building it with her hands and like a hammer and nails, to her trying to open up people to the idea of coffee and giving out free samples, to her getting more customers and having to hire on more help, and even like bringing in other people to bake goods and stuff for her coffee shop. It is so cozy. It does have plot in it. I feel like when cozy fantasy first started coming out as a subgenre, I thought that it didn't really have like a big conflict or plot, but they definitely do in my opinion. And I feel like if you're just looking for, again, something cozy to cuddle up with by the fire as you are fighting off the seasonal depression, I feel like this would be an absolutely phenomenal one. And the last fantasy that I have is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. This is one that is on my favorites of the year. I read it in 2024 and absolutely loved and adored it. We follow Emily, and she is actually a professor at Oxford, and she studies fairies. She is working on this Encyclopedia of Fairies, obviously, so she is going to the last little area that she needs to go to research the fairy species that she doesn't have in her encyclopedia yet, to write about them. And she is not getting along too well with the villagers nearby where she's staying. So her friend, Wendell Brambleby, who's also another professor at Oxford, comes to help her get along better with the villagers so they can help her. And Emily is kind of reluctant friends with Wendell. She doesn't really like people at all, and she has no other friends, and she's like really fine with that. But Wendell really likes being friends with Emily, and Emily recognizes that he is like the only friend that she really has, and he is helping her out and everything. So she begins to bond with him, and it is an amazing book. And I love the fairy element in this story because they do have like more humanoid fairies, but then they also have like little sprites. So I really love this one. I love the characters. I love the little bit of romance that we get. It was just such a fun, cozy read. Next up, moving on to like the miscellaneous genres, I have a literary fiction, and that is Beartown by Frederick Bachman. This takes place in a Canadian town during like winter time, and there is a high school hockey team there, so they are playing hockey and everything like that, and they end up basically going to like the championships, and that is really like amazing for this small town because it would really draw a lot of attention to them and give them kind of like their big break. But something happens at a party in the small town with one of the hockey players on the team that basically fractures the entire town. It really causes a rift in the town. It's really so amazing. It's so well written and it's so heartbreaking. We follow many characters in this town. We get so many different perspectives, and I loved seeing how this one event impacted so many different people, and it really is commentary to show that what does happen in this story does affect everybody around the people that it happens to. It's a very traumatic event, and it can affect so many people and not just the person who was a victim of it. I highly recommend it, and it takes place in Canada. They're doing hockey, it's snowing, it's great for wintertime. And lastly, I have a romance, and that is Ice Planet Barbarians. We're ending off in kind of a silly one, but this is a romance where basically these human women were kidnapped by aliens and they begin to have trouble with their ships. So they left their like entire ship, including the humans, on this ice planet, and there are Ice Planet Barbarians, men that they run into, and our main character strikes up a romance with one of the Ice Planet Barbarians. Again, this takes place on an ice planet, so it's definitely giving winter, it's definitely giving snow. It is kind of silly, goofy, but if you're looking for something just kind of fun to read that's not too serious, and it's just something that's going to be quick to read, I think this is a really great choice. So those are my winter book recommendations. I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. Please let me know what books you would recommend for winter down below, or what's on your winter TBR, because I'm still looking for books for my winter TBR, so I would love to hear any recommendations or TBR that y'all have down below. And I do my seasonal TBRs over on my Patreon for my highest tiers, my slasher queens. So if you want to see what's all going to be on my TBR for the winter, head over to my Patreon so you can get access to that video. And if you made it to the end, leave the little snowflake emoji down below, and I will see y'all in the next one. Bye everybody. I'm writing rhymes in the kitchen, soaking the moments we live in. Yeah, you got the nerve to be on me, taking your life for the IG. If you got my number, don't add me, cause baby, I'm on hiatus. I'm on hiatus. I'm on hiatus.